The invitation. The limousine rolled to a halt on the gravel path, its engine purring like a beast waiting to be unleashed. One by one, 4 individuals stepped out into the misty night, their shoes crunching on the stone path leading up to the mansion's foreboding iron gates. The gates creaked shut behind them, sealing them into a world they knew nothing about. The mansion loomed ahead, draped in shadow and ivy that twisted like gnarled fingers up its walls. Every window was dark, offering no glimpse of what lay inside. The air smelled of damp earth and decay, a hint of rot lurking just beneath the surface of civility. Inside, the dining room was all luxury, a sharp contrast to the eerie exterior. A long, polished table stretched out before the guests, 5 seats arranged with precision. 4 were already filled by the bewildered attendees, each one exchanging furtive glances, their nerves barely masked by forced smiles. "This place," one of them murmured. "It feels off, doesn't it?" Another guest, a tall woman, shivered slightly, though the room was warm. "Did anyone say why we're here?" They didn't need to wait long for an answer. The heavy wooden doors at the far end of the rooms creaked open, and in walked the host, tall, gaunt, with an unsettling smile that never quite reached his hollow eyes. He moved like a shadow, slipping into place. His voice, smooth as silk, but colder than the grave, echoed across the room. "Welcome, my honoured guests. You have been selected for something truly special. A prize, if you will, a chance to share, to reveal the very essence of who you are." He gestured toward the table. "There are 5 seats. 4 for you, my dear guests, and 1 for myself, the humble host of tonight's event." The guests shifted uncomfortably, but curiosity outweighed their fear. They sat, each one sipping from their wine glasses, though the taste had begun to sour. The host's eyes gleamed as he spoke again. "Now, shall we begin? Our first guest, Mr. Harris," he said, turning toward the man at the far end of the table. Harris, a large, gruff man, straightened in his chair. His eyes darted around nervously, and a bead of sweat trickled down the side of his face. "Mr. Harris, let us recount your legacy." Story 1. The Swamp Man. The room darkened. The walls seemed to disappear, and the guests were no longer in the mansion. The dining table, the chairs, the host, all faded away into the shadows. In their place, a night sky flickered above a desolate, fog-covered swamp. The sound of croaking frogs and the distant hum of insects filled the air as the story unfolded like a dream or a nightmare. Harris was a man with no conscience. He took what he wanted: money, belongings, even the last shreds of dignity from those who crossed his path. His words were always cold, sharp as a dagger, and he'd often sneer, "Everyone comes from the swamp," as if the world and the people in it were as filthy as the muck he rose from. On a dark, storm-riddled night, Harris was driving home after his latest exploit, robbing an old neighbour of the last money they had to survive the winter. The storm raged overhead, the wind howling through the trees as rain battered his windshield. The tyres screeched against the slick road, and before Harris could react, his car skidded off the road, crashing into the swamp. The last thing he remembered was the cold water swallowing him whole. For weeks the police searched the area. They found his car, half buried in the mud, but there was no sign of Harris. People whispered about his disappearance, but few cared. He had no friends, no family, only enemies and debts left in his wake. The swamp, it seemed, had claimed him like so many others before, but Harris was not dead. Months passed, and beneath the murky, still waters of the swamp, something stirred. Deep below, buried in the thick mud, Harris opened his eyes. The weight of the swamp pressed down on him, cold and suffocating. His lungs burned, but somehow He did not drown. His body, bloated and decayed, began to rise to the surface, drawn by some dark, unnatural force. The moon was full the night Harris emerged. His head broke the surface, then his shoulders, his arms. The water slid off his withered frame, thick with moss and slime. His skin, once pale and coarse, had become a grotesque mixture of rot and plant life. Moss clung to him, and his flesh, sickly green and grey, peeled like dead bark from a tree. Hollow eyes stared out from a face that was barely human. He stumbled onto the road, water dripping from his limbs. In the distance, headlights glowed through the mist. A car idled by the side of the road, its engine still running. "Help," Harris croaked, his voice low and cracked like dried leaves underfoot. He approached the car, waving weakly for assistance. But the moment the driver saw him, their face twisted in horror. They slammed the car into gear, tires screeching as they sped away into the night. Harris was left alone, his mind clouded with confusion and growing terror. As he walked toward town, the world seemed to recoil from him. The animals fled, rabbits darting into the underbrush, birds taking flight in panic. The air grew colder with each step, the night darker. At the edge of town, Harris spotted a couple walking under the dim glow of streetlights. His heart quickened. He reached out to them, desperate now. "Please help me," he cried, but his voice was more of a rasp, like wind through dry reeds. The couple turned, their faces frozen in terror. They screamed and bolted, vanishing into the night without a second thought. Harris stumbled forward, his steps growing heavier, his legs feeling less and less his own. Finally, he arrived at what had once been his home. The front door was different, freshly painted, the garden tended. He knocked, the sound echoing like a death knell in the silent night. When the door opened, a woman stood there, but she was not the one Harris remembered. She took one look at him and shrieked, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. Harris, frantic, ran around to the back. Maybe she would listen if she saw him again. He didn't know what was happening, but he needed help. As he approached the back window, he caught his reflection in the glass, and the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The figure staring back was no longer a man. His eyes were sunken, skin sloughing off in places, his body twisted and overgrown with moss and vines, his mouth gaping in eternal horror. He stumbled backward, gasping, his mind screaming in denial. The back door swung open. The woman stood behind a man holding a shotgun. "There it is!" she screamed. "The monster!" Harris raised his hands in surrender, pleading, but his words were lost in the rasp of his decayed throat. "Please." The man didn't hesitate. The shotgun roared, and Harris felt the impact tear through him, sending him crumpling to the ground. Back to the diner. The scene snapped back to the dining room. The guests sat in stunned silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. Harris sat at the end of the table, his face pale, his hand trembling as it gripped his wineglass. The host, unbothered, smiled darkly. "Quite the prize, isn't it?" Harris opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply stared ahead, haunted by the horror of his own story. The other guests exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what awaited them next. The host raised his glass, his eyes glinting with malice. "And now, my dear friends, shall we hear from the next guest?" The atmosphere in the dining room is heavy with tension as the first story concludes. Harris, pale and shaken, sits rigidly in his chair, unable to look anyone in the eye. The other guests fidget nervously, glancing between each other and the host, who stands at the head of the table, his ever-present grin unsettling in the flickering candlelight. The host raises an eyebrow, turning his gaze toward the next guest, a woman draped entirely in black, her dark eyes cold and calculating. "And now, it is time to hear from you," the host says smoothly, his voice oozing with dark anticipation. "You have quite a fascinating story, don't you?" The woman shifts in her chair, but remains silent, her expression hard as stone. The room begins to darken again, the walls fading, the table dissolving into shadow, until the guests find themselves no longer in the mansion, but drawn deep into her life. Story 2. The Cat Lady. The scene unfolds inside a dimly lit house, cluttered with old furniture and strewn with discarded belongings. But one thing stands out. Cats. They are everywhere, perched on windowsills, lying atop bookshelves, weaving between the legs of chairs and slinking through every corner. The house smells of musty fur and cat food, and the sound of their constant meowing fills the air like a discordant chorus. The woman moves through the house with purpose, her lips twisted in a satisfied smirk, as she pets one of the sleek black cats that rubs against her leg. "I don't need people," she mutters, scratching the cat under its chin. "Cats are better than any human. Loyal, loving, deserving. People, nothing but scroungers, beggars." She stands by the window, peering out at the street below, watching the world go by with disdain. Whenever someone knocks at her door, seeking charity or a bit of help, she turns them away without a second thought, her heart hardened over the years. Her family? She had long since dismissed them, refusing to entertain their calls or letters. "They'll get nothing from me. When I'm gone, every penny, every scrap of this house will go to my precious cats. They deserve it more than any of those leeches." One afternoon, on her way back from the pet store, her cart loaded with bags of cat food, she strides through the crowded marketplace. She barely notices the old woman in her path, selling small bundles of lavender wrapped in silver foil. "Buy some lavender, dearie?" the old woman asks kindly, holding out a small bouquet. The woman in black scoffs, brushing her aside. "Out of my way, you old hag!" As she barges past, the old woman stumbles and falls to the ground, her flowers scattering across the cobblestones. "Oh, please," the gypsy woman pleads from the ground. "Just a small favour for a little lavender." The woman glares down at her, lips curling in disgust. "I have no time for you or your stupid flowers. My cats are hungry." She crushes one of the fallen lavender bundles under her heel and marches off without another word. Behind her, the old gypsy woman mumbles something under her breath, her voice low and filled with an ancient bitterness. "You like cats so much," the old woman whispers. "Then a cat you shall be. I curse you to walk the world as one of them, until you learn what it means to be alone." The woman, of course, hears nothing, too wrapped in her own selfishness to care. Days pass. One night, she wakes suddenly, her room shrouded in darkness. Something feels wrong, though she can't quite place it at first. She sits up, blinking at the strangeness of the world around her. Everything seems larger. The bed, the room, the very walls of her house loom around her, towering like cliffs. Confusion sweeps over her, and she leaps from the bed, only to land on 4 paws. Her heart races as she scrambles to the mirror. What she sees makes her blood run cold. Staring back at her is not the woman she once was, but a sleek black cat, her own eyes wide with terror. She spins in circles, trying to shake off the impossible reality, but it's no use. Her form is that of a cat, cursed, just as the gypsy had whispered. Suddenly, she hears a low growl. Turning, she sees her beloved cats, once her companions, her cherished pets, hissing and snarling at her, their fur bristles, their claws unsheathed, and their eyes glow with a feral intensity. They no longer see her as their caretaker. Now, she's just another creature in their territory. The cats lunge at her, scratching and biting with wild ferocity. She screeches in pain and terror, racing through the house, trying to escape the relentless onslaught. Desperately, she spots an open window and leaps through it, narrowly avoiding their claws. She lands with a thud in the neighbour's yard. Disoriented, She scrambles to her feet, her tiny heart pounding in her chest. The world is unfamiliar, vast and overwhelming. Panic rises within her as she tries to make sense of what has happened. But before she can catch her breath, a deep, menacing growl echoes from the shadows. She turns, her eyes widening in horror as she sees them. 2 massive Rottweilers, the neighbour's dogs she had always complained about. They stand there, teeth bared, their eyes fixed on her with deadly intent. The realization comes too late. She is no longer the woman with control over her life. She is prey, and before she can even think to run, the dogs pounce. Back to the diner. The scene dissolves, the fog of the woman's fate lifting as the guests find themselves once again in the dining room. The woman in black is silent, her expression blank, but her hands tremble ever so slightly. The other guests look at her, uneasy, their discomfort palpable. The host chuckles softly, swirling the wine in his glass. "Oh, what a tragedy," he murmurs, "and yet so fitting." The woman stares at the host, her lips parting as if to protest, but no words come. Instead, she sits in stunned silence, the weight of her story hanging heavily in the air. The host leans forward, his eyes glittering with dark amusement. "Who's next?" The tension grows thicker with every passing moment. The woman in black remains seated, her face pale, her story weighing heavily on the group. The other guests exchange uneasy glances, unsure of what to expect next. The host's grin never falters as he turns his attention to the man sitting across from her. "Ah, Mr. Carter," the host says, his tone both amused and sinister. "You've always had a fascination with things ancient, haven't you? Tell us, how far does your obsession go?" The man, Carter, a tall figure with thinning hair and sharp features, clenches his fists on the table. His jaw tightens as he stares at the host, but he says nothing. The room begins to fade once more, and as the shadows creep in, the scene changes, drawing the guests into Carter's world. Story 3. The Pharaoh's Curse. Carter has always been a man consumed by one passion: ancient Egypt. Though he wasn't born Egyptian, the culture, the mysteries, the grandeur of the pharaohs and the towering pyramids have captivated him his entire life. He works at a museum as a curator, specializing in Egyptian artifacts, and spends his days surrounded by relics of the past, mummies, sarcophagi, and all things ancient. It is an obsession that drives him. For Carter, Egypt is the pinnacle of human civilization. One evening, as he sips coffee with friends at a cafe, they engage in a heated debate about the construction of the pyramids. "I'm telling you," one of his friends says with a smirk, "the pyramids are impressive, sure, but nothing compared to modern engineering. Look at the skyscrapers we build today. The pyramids, not that big a deal when you think about it." Carter slams his fist on the table, glaring at his friend. "You're wrong. The pyramids are far more than just stone and mortar. They are a testament to intellect, spirituality, and power beyond anything we have today. Everything about Egyptian civilization is superior, more advanced, more intellectual, more in tune with the cosmos. You're blind if you can't see it." His friends exchange awkward glances, shrugging off his outburst with uneasy laughter, but Carter seethes with frustration. He knows the truth. Egypt holds secrets far greater than anyone realizes, and soon he will be closer to that truth than ever before. A few days later, an object arrives at the museum where Carter works. It is small and ancient, an exquisite golden scarab, encrusted with faded gems, its surface etched with hieroglyphs that speak of long-forgotten rituals. The moment Carter lays eyes on it, he feels a strange pull, an almost magnetic force drawing him closer. Ignoring the warning signs placed around the display, he reaches out and touches the scarab, brushing his fingers along its sharp edges. In an instant, a sharp pain shoots through his hand. He pulls back, staring at the fresh cut on his finger, blood dripping onto the museum floor. He shrugs it off at first, but as the days pass, strange things begin to happen. At night, Carter dreams of the museum, but not as he knows it. In his dreams, he wanders the darkened halls, guided by something unseen. He watches himself perform rituals, arcane ceremonies, chanting in a language he has never learned, summoning powers he does not understand. The dreams grow more vivid each night, until he sees something that makes his blood run cold. An army of the dead rising from the earth, marching under his command, unleashed upon the world. The nightmares haunt him, but they are not the only strange occurrences. Carter's colleagues and even his boss begin to notice his appearance. He looks sick, pale, gaunt, as if something is draining the life from him. "Carter, you don't look well," his boss tells him one morning. "Maybe you should take some time off." Carter snaps at him, his temper fraying at the edges. "I'm fine. I don't need rest. I need to work. You wouldn't understand." He storms out of the room, only to find himself drawn back to the scarab. There, in the museum, he reads the plaque beneath the cursed object. The very scarab he had cut himself on. It describes the artifact as belonging to an ancient pharaoh, a ruler who had been buried with the intention of returning from the dead. The legend spoke of his oath to rise once more, bringing an army with him to reclaim the world. Suddenly, Carter catches a glimpse of his reflection in a nearby display case. What he sees chills him to the bone. There, in the glass, he doesn't just see himself. He sees something, someone clinging to him. A decayed figure, its skeletal arms wrapped around him like a parasite, its face twisted and grotesque. The Pharaoh. He is there, draining Carter's life essence, feeding on his very soul, growing stronger while Carter grows weaker. Desperate, Carter visits a doctor. The doctor, after a brief examination, dismisses his concerns as exhaustion, but after running some tests, the doctor frowns at a strange anomaly in Carter's X-ray. It shows two sets of bones, Carter's and something else, another figure, looming just behind him, its skeletal form intertwined with his. "That's odd," the doctor says, shaking his head. "Must be a mistake." But Carter knows better. The Pharaoh is real, and he is growing stronger. Whenever Carter looks into a mirror, the decaying figure is there, hovering just over his shoulder, draining him more and more each day. Carter feels his body weakening, his energy sapped, his mind slipping into madness, and as the days pass, the Pharaoh's grip on him tightens. Finally, at his weakest, Carter collapses in his home, his body unable to resist any longer. He feels the ancient presence take over, flooding his veins with the power of the undead. His eyes snap open, but they are no longer his own. The Pharaoh speaks through Carter's mouth, his voice ancient and cold. "With this body, I shall raise my army of the dead, and I shall bring hell upon the earth." Carter, now nothing more than a vessel for the Pharaoh, stands, his body moving under the control of a force far older and darker than himself. He walks out into the night, his mind screaming, trapped inside his own body, as the Pharaoh prepares to unleash his ancient curse upon the world. Back to the diner. The scene shifts back to the dining room, where the guests sit in stunned silence. Carter slumps in his chair, his face pale and drenched in sweat. He trembles, unable to meet the other's eyes, knowing that his story is far from over. The host chuckles darkly, raising his glass. "Ah, the power of the ancients, and the price one must pay for such knowledge." Carter shivers, his hands gripping the table, as if trying to ground himself in reality. But the others know. It is already too late for him. The host's eyes gleam with wicked delight as he turns to the next guest. "Shall we continue?" The air is thick with tension as the host turns his gaze towards the final guest, a woman named Kathy. She shifts uneasily in her seat, sensing that her turn has come. The host, with a knowing grin, leans forward. "Ah, Kathy," he says, his voice silky and mocking. "An artist of sorts, I believe. Tell us, have you ever truly understood the depth of the art you work with? Or perhaps some pieces are better left forgotten?" Kathy stiffens, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wineglass. She opens her mouth to respond, but the room begins to fade, the edges of reality blurring as the story of her life takes shape. Kathy had always loved art. Her work as an art restorer allowed her to spend her days immersed in the beauty of the past, carefully preserving masterpieces that had stood the test of time. Her colleagues respected her skill, and the museum where she worked often entrusted her with delicate, centuries-old pieces. One day, Kathy is assigned a new project. A large dark painting arrives at the museum, discovered in the basement of an old decrepit mansion that had been abandoned for years. The painting is old, 17th century they believe, and depicts a shadowy figure, a nobleman dressed in black, standing in a dimly lit room. The canvas is badly deteriorated, the colours faded and cracked, and the nobleman's face is almost entirely scratched out, as if someone had tried to erase his identity. Kathy is immediately drawn to it, feeling a strange, inexplicable connection to the piece. She's eager to restore it, to bring the figure back to life. But as soon as she begins her work, strange things happen. The first incident occurs late one night, when Kathy stays behind in the museum after hours. She's alone in the dimly lit restoration room, carefully working on the painting, when she hears a soft whisper, just barely audible, like the faintest breath of wind. She looks around, but there's no one there. She shrugs it off as her imagination, but over the next few days, the whispers grow louder, more persistent. They seem to come from the painting itself, a faint murmur of words she can't quite make out. Still, she tells herself it's nothing, just the isolation of working late at night. But then she begins having nightmares. In her dreams, Kathy finds herself wandering the museum's empty halls. The walls seem to stretch and warp, twisting in ways that make no sense. The lighting flickers, and the temperature drops until her breath hangs in the air. In the distance, she sees the figure from the painting, but he's no longer confined to the canvas. He walks through the halls, moving toward her, his face still a blur, a shadow where his features should be. Each night, the dreams grow more vivid, more terrifying. The figure follows her, silent but relentless, his presence heavy with malice. During the day, Kathy throws herself into her work, determined to finish restoring the painting. But with each stroke of her brush, she notices something unsettling. The nobleman's face, once barely visible, is becoming clearer on its own. No matter how carefully she works, the image seems to restore itself faster than she can explain. Her colleagues notice her change in demeanour. They comment on how tired she looks, how pale and gaunt she's become. She brushes off their concerns, but deep down, she knows something is wrong. The painting is doing something to her, draining her energy, consuming her thoughts. Then, one afternoon, Kathy catches a glimpse of herself in a mirror. At first, she thinks it's just her reflection. She's tired after all, but then she notices something that makes her heart stop. Behind her, standing just over her shoulder, is the figure from the painting. His face is clearer now, no longer a blur. His eyes, hollow and dark, seem to pierce through her. She spins around, but no one is there. Terrified, Kathy digs deeper into the history of the painting. She discovers that it once belonged to a noble family, the last descendant of which vanished under mysterious circumstances. The painting had been scratched and damaged deliberately, she learns, by the nobleman himself before his death. The legend claimed that he had been cursed, his soul trapped within the portrait for eternity, seeking a vessel to escape. And now Kathy realizes with growing horror she is that vessel. In a panic, Kathy tries to destroy the painting. She throws it to the ground, slashing at it with a knife, tearing at the canvas. But as she does, she feels an icy force gripping her, freezing her in place. The painting, despite her efforts, begins to mend itself. The rips close up, the scratches fade, and the nobleman's face becomes clearer than ever. In her reflection, Kathy sees the truth. The nobleman's spirit has latched onto her, draining her life force, slowly taking over her body. Her face has become gaunt, her skin pale, and her eyes hollow, just like his. Desperate, she seeks out help, but no one believes her. They say she's overworked, that she needs rest. But Kathy knows the truth. Every night, the figure in her nightmares gets closer. Every day, she feels weaker, her body no longer fully her own. Finally, it happens. One evening, as Kathy sits in her apartment, too weak to move, the painting comes to life. The nobleman steps out of the canvas, his figure tall and imposing, his face now fully restored. He smiles, a cold, cruel smile, as he approaches her. "I've waited centuries for this," he whispers, his voice like a death rattle. "You've given me what I needed. Your life, for mine." Kathy tries to scream, but no sound escapes her lips. The nobleman places his hand on her chest, and she feels her strength draining away completely. Her vision blurs, darkness closing in, as the nobleman takes her place in the world. The last thing Kathy sees before she slips into unconsciousness is her reflection in the window, her body now hollow, lifeless, trapped forever in the painting, her face frozen in silent terror. Back to the diner. The room snaps back into focus. Kathy sits in stunned silence, her face pale and drained, her hands shaking. The other guests stare at her in horror, their own fear reflected in her eyes. The host chuckles softly, swirling his wine. Ah, the price of art. Isn't it fascinating how far one can fall in the pursuit of beauty? Kathy opens her mouth to protest, but no words come. She sits motionless, trapped in the knowledge of her fate. The host, grinning with dark delight, rises from his seat. "And now, my dear guests, I believe our dinner is complete." The main course. The air in the room grows impossibly thick, the tension palpable as the guests sit in stunned silence, each of them haunted by their own dark stories. The host, still grinning, takes a slow sip from his wineglass before setting it down with a deliberate clink. The sound echoes ominously through the room. He stands, adjusting his suit with an unsettling calmness, his gaze sweeping over each of the four guests. Harris, the swamp man, the woman in black, now pale as a ghost, Carter, still trembling from his encounter with the Pharaoh, and Kathy, who barely seems to breathe after reliving her nightmare. "You've all shared your stories," the host says, his voice low and almost mocking. "But now, it's time for the final part of our evening." The guests shift in their seats, unease growing into outright fear. Harris glances toward the door, but something is wrong. The heavy wooden doors, once slightly ajar, slam shut with a deafening thud. The windows, previously framed with velvet curtains, are now barred with thick wrought iron grates that slide into place with a sinister creak. The room is sealed tight, and there is no way out. "What is this?" Kathy whispers, her voice trembling. The host's smile widens, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. Teeth that are far too long, too sharp for any human mouth. His eyes darken. the pupils elongating into narrow, predatory slits. The room grows colder, shadows creeping across the floor as if alive, writhing like serpents around the table. "You see," the host continues, his voice now deeper, more guttural, "the stories were merely the appetizers." His fingers lengthen, the nails curving into talon-like claws as his body begins to contort and twist. His skin ripples and darkens, muscles bulging under his clothes as they tear away, revealing a grotesque form underneath. His face elongates, his jaw unhinging like that of a serpent, rows of razor-sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. The guests are frozen in place, their horror mounting as they watch the host transform before their eyes. He is no longer a man, but something ancient and monstrous, a creature that has lurked in the shadows of nightmares for centuries, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "The main course," the creature snarls, its voice dripping with malevolence,
"is you."
Harris leaps from his chair, scrambling for the door, but it's no use. The locks hold firm, the door unmoving. He pounds against it, screaming for help, but no one is coming. The creature moves faster than they can comprehend, its long clawed arms reaching out. Harris is the first to be dragged across the floor, his screams piercing the silence as the creature's jaws descend upon him. Blood splatters across the floor, the sickening sound of flesh tearing filling the room. The woman in black tries to crawl under the table, her hands shaking, but the creature is upon her next. Its talons pierce her skin as it drags her into the shadows, her cries of terror echoing in the darkness. Carter, pale and trembling, backs into a corner, muttering under his breath, trying to summon the strength to fight, but it's no use. The creature's gaze falls on him, its eyes glowing with hunger. With a single, swift movement, it lunges at him, its jaws clamping down, muffling his final scream. Kathy, the last remaining guest, stares in horror, her mind unable to process the carnage unfolding around her. She tries to run, but the shadows seem to pull at her, trapping her in place. The creature turns its attention to her, its monstrous face inches from hers, its breath hot and rancid. "You've all shared such wonderful stories," it hisses, its voice a low growl, but nothing compares to the tale of a soul devoured. Kathy's scream is cut short as the creature sinks its fangs into her neck, the room filling with the grotesque sounds of feeding. The end. Outside, the mansion stands in eerie silence, its dark windows offering no glimpse of the horrors within. The once peaceful night is shattered by the sound of blood-curdling screams that echo through the air, only to be swallowed by the night. And then, silence.